My name is Shelley. If you heard what I heard, you would never forget.
If you heard what I heard. This podcast shares the powerful stories of Holocaust survivors, told by their grandchildren, the last generation to ever hear Holocaust survivor stories firsthand. So join me as we listen, learn, and remember. Together, we can make sure the world will never forget so that it never happens again.
I am the grandchild of two incredible Holocaust survivors, Solomon Reinstein and Dora Daches. I will be sharing my incredible grandmother's story and her mother's story with you guys today. My grandmother, Dora Daches, was born in 1927 in Vilna. She did not have any siblings. Her father left her when she was 1 year old, sadly. My grandmother was not a religious Jew. She lived in Vilna with her mother. They were very close. Her mother had her when she was around like 16, 17 years old. Her mother ran an apartment building. She was kind of like a landlord, and my grandmother helped her. She was always working at a very young age, and they had a pretty normal life. Her mother remarried to a man named Babka, and he had a lot of kids, so those became her like step siblings. She never really had any relationship with her father after he left her. When she was 11, the Germans and the Russians came to a settlement, a deal. So things were pretty normal until the age of 13 when the Germans took over. The Nazis came in and took all the Jews to the ghetto. They said, you have to go to the ghetto. Once in the ghetto, life was absolutely terrible. If you did anything wrong when you were in the ghetto, you were either sent to the forest to be shot or you were sent to the concentration camp. So she did her best trying to survive. There was one time where a man named Jacob Gans he was actually half Jewish, and he thought of himself as Jewish. He was in charge of deciding which Jews would be killed and which Jews would be spared. And her name came up to be killed. And she ran up in line and begged this man, Jacob Gans, and said, I promise I will have a big Jewish family and increase the Jewish population if you spare me and spare my mother. And he actually listened to her. He spared her that day. And many years later, she found him and thanked him for sparing her life. To her stepbrothers happened to be in the furrier business. And at the time, there was a shortage of furs. So when the Germans almost lost the war because weren't warm enough, they had a big call to get furs. So she was named an essential worker. So it also helped spare her. When my grandmother was around 14 years old, she had been in the Vilna Ghetto for around 2.5 years. They got word that the Nazis were coming the next day and she would probably be sent to the concentration camps. So in order to survive, she was not going to be going to the concentration camps. She put on all the clothes she had. So she had 5 dresses. So she put on all 5 dresses and they took their photos of their family that they had with them. So they took their photos and stormed the gates. The Nazis actually didn't mind when Jews stormed the gates because it was fun for them because they could just kill them while they were running. So by a miracle, her and her mother were able to storm the gates, jump over the gates, and make it back to Vilna. All they had were the dresses that they were wearing and their family photos. They were absolutely starving. They had really nothing to their name, but they made it out of the ghetto. So when they went back to Vilna, they actually went back to the apartment building that my grandmother's mother had been running. And they knew the landlord and they begged to let them stay in the apartment building. He said it was fine as long as they were in the basement. So my grandmother was really protective of her mother. I mean, there wasn't a big age difference, but it was kind of up to her to find food for the two of them. So my grandmother, during the day, sometimes to get food, she would put on a cross and she would go around asking for food. One time, a crazy story and shows how my grandmother can think on her feet was that, she saw a group of kids that she knew before she had gone to the ghetto, and they were screaming and pointing and said, "You're a Jew, you're a Jew." She saw them telling the Nazis that a Jew was out. And so during that time, she knocked on a stranger's door, asked for a glass of water. The stranger let her in her house. She was wearing a cross. She had water and she missed the Nazis. So these stories, I have so many amazing stories about my grandmother, but this just shows how she has the ultimate survival skills and how she was able to think on her feet. Once the war was over, things were much better, but they were still not great. So they needed money, they needed ways to survive. My grandmother was around 16 years old, and on Rosh Hashanah, her and her mother went to services. And she saw a man wearing talit that looked very handsome. He was actually married at the time, and she was talking to him and flirting with him, and he wound up leaving his wife for my grandmother. My grandfather survived the siege of Leningrad, which was really incredible. He would eat shoe leather to survive. There was absolutely no food. When the war was over, it was better. He was very good with electronics. So he was in the Russian military, and he would fix the telephones around Vilna. So he met my grandmother around 44 in Vilna after the war. And against my great grandmother's wishes, they took a train. It was very unsafe to go anywhere, and decided to get married. They decided to move to Germany. So my grandmother and grandpa were in a displaced person camp in Germany, Fehrenbelt, and they were given the option of either going to Palestine, which is Israel now, or going to America. They chose to go to America because my grandfather's brother Max said, "Come here." He was living in New York, around Brownsville, New York. And so my grandmother actually flew because she was 8 months pregnant. She flew with my dad, he was around 1 or 2 years old. They flew to New York, and she had my Uncle Philip. So when they got to New York, life was still really difficult. They had no money, they had no jobs, they had to learn the language. It was a completely different type of culture when they were in New York. They felt very out of place. And my grandmother had odd jobs. She worked in a dentist office, and my grandfather was an engineer. So they had to kind of start from the beginning, and also had absolutely no money. They eventually moved out of their Uncle Max's house to Canarsie. My grandparents had 4 kids, so my grandmother was right. She promised she would have a big family. Susie, Florence, Philip, and my dad, Alan. So my grandparents really rebuilt their life from nothing when they came from Germany. My grandparents never got along. There was fighting every day. My dad laughs that the police were called every other day when he was growing up. He was sadly beaten, and his parents just did not know how to acclimate themselves into America. My grandfather was tough. He was very tough on, my dad. tells a story of he used to love baseball cards, and my grandfather came home one day after my dad had collected all these baseball cards, and he was very angry coming from the war and not making money. He came home and ripped every single baseball card in front of my dad, his like collection that he had forever. So life was really hard for my father growing up, really hard for his siblings growing up. And just an absolutely terrible time. They fought horribly. So my dad has photos of him when he was little with a black eye. It was a very, very horrible childhood. They had nothing to eat. They never sat down once for a family dinner. My Aunt Florence, when she was 13, found a guy in New York on a motorcycle and like left for weeks at a time and came back weeks later. It was just, an absolutely crazy childhood. So my grandparents actually got divorced when my Aunt Susie was a little girl. They had a terrible relationship forever, but no one got divorced back then. So they wound up getting divorced. My grandmother met George, her husband, who was a doctor, and she had a much better life after she met George. He was very calm and he loved her for who she was. He was American, and like my grandmother is, after growing up having absolutely no money, she was very good at making money. She grew his practice, grew his business. And my grandmother invested real estate in New York when, she started making little money. She was very smart with investments. Family was always very important to her. So our vacations were all spent being with the family. And that was just very important to her. I have so many memories of her saying family, 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 because that's what, what she always wanted. So there's so many memories I have of my grandmother when other and just shows like the type of person she was. She was the ultimate survivor. She came from such a hard upbringing. She knew what was important in life, and she always wanted to make money, and money was so important to her, and success was so important to her. And so later in life, she really, after her investments and coming from absolutely nothing, she led this absolutely incredible life with like wealth and jewelry and grandchildren and, you know, had boyfriends up until the very end. Love was very important to her. And so she was an absolutely incredible woman. And I'm so grateful that I have even some of her strength in me. So my grandmother was an absolutely incredible person. She wouldn't take no for an answer. She was a true survivor and such a strong person. I think a great example is how she could think on her feet. And when the Nazis were coming, she knew to knock on someone's door to ask for a glass of water to survive. So she had incredible survival skills. So coming to America and living in New York, she had incredible survival skills. So she knew how to get a job, how to talk someone into hiring her when she couldn't speak the language, how to find a husband, how to make him money, how to, you know, just live a successful life through survival, through true toughness. I always knew my grandmother was really special. And, I knew she survived the Holocaust. It wasn't like a memory of, they sat me down one day and said, your grandmother survived the Holocaust. It was, since I can remember, my dad was like, your grandmother's a really special person. She went through a lot. And, she never she took us to see Schindler's List actually when we were little. She would just give us nuggets and pieces at a time. So it was not like, sit down, I need to tell you my story. She didn't want to talk about it so much. She wanted to talk about the fact that family is so important. Making your own money is so important. Being successful is so important. But it wasn't like, let me sit down and tell you my story. It was just like, I'm a survivor. You come from survivor genes. You're going to be successful in life. It's important to be successful. When my grandmother talked about the Holocaust, she was not angry. She would sometimes tear up, but my grandmother was very like, confident in I had a crazy story, but it got me to this point and I'm a survivor and it's okay that I went through this for my family. I've been through a lot, but it wasn't, she's not very like, um, she's, survivors have something very, very special. My grandmother's friend was diagnosed with cancer when he was 50, and he walked out of the doctor's office and said, I've survived the Holocaust. I'm not having chemo. I'll survive cancer. And he lived for like 25 more years. So that's a good example of kind of like how tough Holocaust survivors are. Nothing was a big deal to her. She had been through so much. So if I was ever nervous or stressed about anything, I loved calling her because it was nothing to her. I run a very successful PR business and I've grown it from me on my dining room table to a company of 135 people. And I have been through so much with the agency and the ups and downs, and I would not have any of it if it weren't for my grandmother. She was tough and she was a survivor and she had very thick skin. And I feel I'm successful today because I have just an ounce of her in me. And I feel so lucky that she is my blood and my grandmother and that, I have success and it's truly because of her. In my Jewish life today, I actually married a wonderful Jewish man, and I would never not marry a Jewish person because I know how important it was to her and how important it is to my father. And so I married a wonderful Jewish man. We celebrate Shabbat mostly every Friday. We light Shabbat candles, and have the same opinion of how important tradition is. And we obviously go to synagogue on the high holidays, and I think about her so much, and feel her in me and her spirit in me. She had incredible spirit. There is terrible anti-Semitism in this world. The Jews are, kind of always have a target on their back. And it's so important that we, know right from wrong, and that we, you know, having all of Israel is so important. I mean, my grandmother had been through so much to survive the Holocaust. We obviously can never ever forget, like 9/11. You can never forget what happened. Like the Jews, you can never forget what happened with the Holocaust. We have to, keep these stories alive, keep having people. There's a Shoah Foundation at USC that is wonderful. And I just think the more knowledge, the better about, history, and so we don't repeat the same mistakes. It's heartbreaking to hear that so many people don't know about the Holocaust. Sure. I want my kids to know so much about my grandmother, from running away from machine guns and scaling a wall with her mother, to surviving, to pivoting and going into the fur industry to be an essential worker. And yeah, I want my kids to know how important my grandmother's story is, to think about the hard life that she went through to make sure that my dad and his siblings were born, to make sure that they understand the journey that she went through and how hard it was to survive. And she did it for her family, and how important family is. Yeah, I want my kids to know that this happened. I want them to go to the Holocaust Memorial Museum. I want them to know as much as possible about their relatives and what it took to survive, and how important it is to never forget what happened. If someone came up to me and said they don't believe in the Holocaust, I think I would like lose my mind. I can't even go there because I'm not good at keeping my emotions in. So I would tell them the story. I would show them the history. I would try and calmly tell them and make them understand what Jews have been through and what it took to get here. My grandmother wanted me to know about the Holocaust when she heard Schindler's List was coming out. She was very insistent I fly to New York and like go see the film with her. So after we talked about her story and how important it was for her for us to know her story. She also did recordings for the Shoah Foundation, and she gave them to us so we would never forget them. What I love most about my grandmother is that it was so hard for her to survive. She survived. She got her mother out of prison. She survived by, knocking on people's doors and begging them for her to plead for her life. She came here with not a dollar in her pocket. She, by the end, died with millions of dollars and a huge family and just an incredible, she was hilarious and wonderful and so special.
Thank you for listening to If You Heard What I Heard. If you'd like to learn more about our work and support our mission to make sure the world never forgets, please visit our website, ifyouheardwhatiheard.com. We will never let these stories be lost. It is the job of our generation to make sure future generations never forget so that it never happens again.